Hey, welcome to the last day of conference. I hope it's been really awesome. It's certainly been awesome to have you guys here. My name is Amy. I'm a product manager at Tableau and a hopeless romantic. You are in this session on parameters, so I hope you want to go to parameter land because that's where we're going. And you may be wondering, what are we going to do in parameter land? We're going to define and use parameters in all sorts of ways. We'll see examples of exactly what makes a parameter tick, and we will see the advantages and limitations of parameters in Tableau. My goal is, whether you knew what a parameter was when you walked in the door, when you leave the session today, that you are fully ready to parameterize your data. And maybe you'll even develop that special feeling for parameters that I have. Just so you know, some of the content was carried forward from the same session I gave last year, and some of it's new. But before we get going, I have a question for you. Do you remember the first time you saw a parameter? How it made you feel? I do. It's Friday night. I'm home alone, lonely. I'm hungry, but I don't want to cook because it's no fun cooking for one. So I'm on the computer as usual, looking for love. Where am I looking? Right here. Free training videos on Tableau.com. There's so many intriguing options. This is the one that got me. It's a simple chart. We're looking at orders, shipping cost, and profit. And there's some blue stuff in a line. And there's a video playing and a narration in the background. And I'm half paying attention. And then all of a sudden, this happens. And there's all these orange things and the line moves. It's amazing. Listen, my upbringing and visualization is kind of old. I'm kind of old. I'm older than I look, okay? And so, I'm used to like things on pages, printed kind of stuff. So to see a view respond interactively like this, it was magical. I was hooked at first sight. So I downloaded the workbook and started to unpack it. And I learned that this shipping cost cutoff control in the upper right, well, it looks like a filter. It's actually a parameter. Parameters. Such a beautiful name. One thing led to another, and I went quickly from this to this. Couldn't help myself. Have you done that too? I was captivated and I needed to learn more. So I spent the rest of the evening Googling Tableau parameters. And let's see a few of the basic examples I found. So in this example, we're looking at coffee sales by product. And you'll notice up in the upper right, there's this top end control. And it says 5. And I have 5 bars. And as I change the value of the control, the number of marks in my view is changing accordingly. So I can use a parameter to bring the most important, the top marks into my view, or the bottom marks, whatever those are. And how this works is actually over here on the filter pill. When I edit the filter, there's a top option in the dialog. And you'll notice that there's this by field, I can say top or bottom, but then there's this top end again, this top end parameter. And so you could see I could set it to a number of different parameters, or I could even create a new parameter right here. So that was really exciting. And then I learned that you can do a really similar thing with sets in Tableau. So again, we have a top end control on the upper right. And notice it's set to 4, and there's 4 blue bars. And as I change the value of the parameter, the number of blue bars increases. So I can control the color using a parameter. And how this actually works is over in the sets editor. again, there's this top option. And when I select it, it looks very familiar to the filter options. I can say top or bottom. I can choose a parameter. And maybe you've seen this variable bin size example, where I'm looking at a distribution of data. And I already have this variable bin size parameter over here, but it doesn't change. So, well, how does it actually work? How do I get it in? On the left, I go to the field in the data pane, the bin itself, and choose Edit. And there's this size of bins option. And when I click this drop down, there's all this parameter stuff in there as well. So I can actually change it to a parameter that's set up to specify the bin size. And the value is 2 right now, so the view will immediately change the bin size. And of course, I can change it more to understand the distribution of my data. So I spent the night Googling with parameters. And I saw some examples like that and some other examples that we won't show. And after a few hours of watching videos and downloading workbooks and playing with data, I found this. Tableau's dating profile, Tableau parameter dating profile online at datalovasonline.com. It's like Match or OkCupid for data. Look at parameter's adorable face. Look at those green eyes. I'm a sucker for green eyes. So Tableau parameter, control freak seeks data lova for sweet interactive exploration. You don't have to be flexible because I am. Hobbies and interests include playing with data. We have that in common. Stretching, we do not have that in common. And making balloon animals, which, I mean, that could be really fun. I had a dilemma. You know, I want to reach out, swipe right, as the kids say. But I am already really obsessed, and I don't want parameters to know how much I like them. We haven't even met yet. As I muster the courage to contact them, I consider, should we have dinner? That seems really serious. How about lunch? I'm too nervous to eat. So we met for coffee. And I could tell parameters liked me right away. They kept bragging about being flexible and enabling end user input and control. I tried to hide that I was impressed, but you know, I'm transparent. So when parameters said, I can smooth out your trend line, I got tingles. I'll show you. So here we're looking at this sales over time for Superstore, and there's actually 2 lines in the view, right? There's the gray line is the actual sales by order date, and then the red line is a moving average calculation on the sales that takes advantage of the built-in table calculation for moving average in Tableau. And how this average is currently being calculated is based on the default setting, which is an offset, a start offset, and an end offset. And so by default, it's -2 to 0, which is basically 3 points, right? And then averaged. Well, this line actually doesn't look as smooth as I was led to believe it would. So what I'd like to do is use a parameter to experiment with how smooth I want the line. Now, I've already created this moving average parameter, and I've already added it to the view. It's in the upper right here. And you can see it's loaded with numbers that correspond to date-like increments. So what I want to do is bring that parameter into my table calculation here. So how I do that is I go ahead and I just pick up this calculation and drag it into the data pane. And then I'm going to call it moving average. And just as a side note, as we go on today, I'll try to make sure to name things according to the examples. So if I forget to do that, you can tell me. But so now we have this calculation, and we'll go ahead and edit it. And so I can see it's exactly the same calculation now, but I can see the whole thing. And so in order to bring the parameter into play here, all I need to do is replace this 2 with the name of the parameter, which is moving average. Now notice that Tableau automatically fully addressed my field, okay? Because I have a field named, calculation named moving average as well. So, just make sure that if you have things that are named the same, you're referencing the right object, and Tableau will try to help. It's easy to keep in mind that parameters are purple. So I made this change. I've brought the parameter into play here. And so now the question is, what will happen when I apply? So watch the view underneath. The value of the parameter is 30. And so as I apply that new calculation, then the line actually smooths out. And I can change it. I can have kind of more variation in my data, or I could just look at a year. Well, that's not very interesting at all. But I can start to see kind of cycles, right, in my data using the parameter. Then parameter told me about swapping fields. So I'll show you this one. So here we're looking at a simple view. It's sales by category. And let's say I'm an analyst and I want to deliver this to a customer. And I know they want to know about sales for their categories. But I suspect they're also going to want to know about profit or discount or other measures or KPIs that are of interest to them. And if I don't kind of anticipate that and give that to them, they're going to come back and ask for it, right? So I can actually help my end users by providing a little bit more flexibility, anticipating what they might want up front. What I want to do here is include the sales by category, but I also want to show profit, okay? So we're going to use a parameter to do that. And how I do this, I've already created this parameter in the lower left. See the field swap parameter? So let's add it to the view by showing the parameter control. And let's see what we have in here. We have sales and we have profit. Okay, and so now what I want to do is incorporate this into the view. And so how I'm going to do that is through a calculation. I created the swap fields calculation on the left, and I'll go ahead and edit it, and we'll take a look. And it's pretty straightforward. It says if the value of the parameter is sales, then return the field sales. It doesn't have to be the same field. In this example, it is. Otherwise, if it's profit, go ahead and return profit. Okay? So now all I need to do is bring this field into the view. And what I'll do is I'll actually go ahead and just replace sales with my new calculation. So I'll drag the swap fields measure on top of sum of sales. And notice the view slightly changed. It wasn't dramatic. I'm still looking at sales. But you also notice maybe the axis label changed now, right? And as I change the parameter, it looks like it's working. That's awesome. So I could load this full of all sorts of measures. And when I do that, of course, and deliver this, I want to make sure that people know what they're looking at. So I can add the parameter to the sheet title in the tooltip dialog. I can choose the parameter here and apply that. And so now it actually says sales corresponding to my parameter or profit. Another way I could help make sure people understand what they're looking at is I can add the value of the parameter to the tooltip. So I clicked the tooltip on the marks card to bring up the tooltip editor. And see this swap fields? That's literally that field name. All I need to do is replace that with whatever is the current value of the parameter. So I'll go ahead and I'll just select swap fields. And again, there's my parameter to insert. Choose OK. And now when I hover over a mark, it tells me actually the profit, the literal profit, is 145, or the sales. Now, anticipating your question, well, can I just put the parameter right here? Like, what if that just said sales? And right now, as a caution, in Tableau, we don't allow parameters in axis titles yet. So what a lot of people will do in this case, because they do want the actual measure name on the axis, is they will create a new sheet and float it over the axis title and then put the parameter value in that sheet. Okay, so there is a way to work around that. So we looked at how to swap fields, but the swapping fields thing goes even further. I was sitting on a plane with a customer on the way to TC, and they were talking about how they use parameters, because that's what I do on the plane, is I'm like, how do you use parameters? And one thing they talked about was, they have a semi-self-service environment where they want to give people just the tiniest bit of ability to author views, but they don't want to expose the full power of Tableau to all the users. And so what they'll do is they'll use this field swapping concept that I just showed you in a specific way. It's in it helps to build pivot tables. So let's take a look at that. So here I've just constructed kind of a pivot table based on Superstore. But if we look up here, we look up in the columns and the rows, we look over on the marks card. These aren't actually, data fields. They are, and so I'm using parameters in the view to decide what to show for the fields. And so, let's say I wanted to see the segment. I want to see my pivot table broken down by segment at the top. Then I can just choose how I want to slice and dice this data. Not only can you use parameters to switch these fields, but you can even use parameters to change sheets in a workbook, in a dashboard. So let me show you that, the swap sheets example. So here I have this precious real estate. It's one view, and it's sales by state, but it's geographic, and maybe I want to be able to see different perspectives on this data. So I can use a parameter called swap sheet to decide which chart to show in the view. And so a lot of times when you're dealing with a limited amount of screen real estate, but you want to give users some flexibility over the perspective, you can use this swap sheet technique to change, to let end users change between sheets in the view. And how this works is it takes advantage of the variable flow layout in dashboards. It's well documented in the community. So I'll let you go and look up more if you're interested, or you can contact me. You can see with swapping fields and swapping sheets, you have some power here to anticipate and build flexibility into your views in a way that both optimizes the real estate you have available and also allows end users to, in a self-service way, kind of answer more of their own questions. I think this is cool. You can tell Parameters and I spent a little bit of time together, and honestly, I can't help the feeling I was falling in love a little bit. I mean, you can probably guess what happened next. One thing led to another, and Parameters and I, we spent some time at night together, I guess. A little embarrassed. We got acquainted in all sorts of ways, that parameters can be used interactively in Tableau. The list on the left is a list of really, I would call them basic or intermediate examples. They're very well documented in the help and in the community, and you've probably tried these yourself. And the ones on the right are sort of the Jedi level use cases for parameters, and we're not going to talk about those today, but I did want you to know that they exist if you want to go and learn more about them. We're going to talk about more use cases for parameters today. And as you review the list, I just want to make sure to point out that the cross-data source filtering in the upper left and the second one, the highlighting, these are scenarios where we found customers use parameters so much that in Tableau 10, we just implemented them as native features in Tableau. So in Tableau 10 and above, you can do cross-data source filtering, or you can do highlighting without a parameter. We also did some work on the set default filter dates, which is 3 from the bottom on the left, but we have a lot of more work to go there. So we'll look at that. This is a list of some of the special moments I've shared with parameters, or that customers have shared with parameters that turn out to be really useful. So we're going to talk about the 10 on the list that except for cross-data source filtering and highlighting. We'll talk about the rest. Let's take a trip down memory lane. So first, we'll visit a few of my favorite dates with parameters. So in this first scenario, the customer's asked you for some measure over time, let's say sales. And so you deliver sales by day. Oh, it's cut out. Thank you so much for letting me know. Okay, so it's the cable. My bad. Please do let me know. Sorry, if the screen disappears again. It would be a really bad session for you if you couldn't see what I was referring to. So you deliver sales by date over time. And the customer comes back right away and says, okay, but it's, I want to see it by month, or I want to see it by year. And so with the date drill down example, you can actually expose that as an interactive option for end users to look at. So let's actually see what I'm talking about. So here's my sales over time, and I've broken it down by region. And so I can get a sense of how Central, East, South, and West sales are doing. But what I want to be able to do is give users the ability to change the level of detail of the order date on columns. Currently, it's date, but maybe I want week or month or quarter or year. So we'll use a parameter. Let's create one together. We haven't done that yet. I'll go over to the data pane. I'll click Create Parameter. And this example is date drill down. And I'm going to make the data type string. And I'm going to set a list of allowable values. And I'm going to be very specific about this list. Okay, and so I've intentionally chosen string values that the date trunk function in Tableau recognizes, because I'm going to use it with that function. So I'll go ahead and I'll choose OK. And notice in the lower left, my parameter was added to the data pane in the parameters shelf. And I can add that parameter to the view. Okay. And I can change the value of the parameter, and yeah, that's kind of fun, but actually nothing's happening. So what do I need to do to incorporate this into the view? Calculation, yes, thank you, great. Just wanted to make sure I'm landing a few concepts here. So great, all we need to do is involve the parameter in the calculated field. So I've pre-created a calculated field because I don't type well on video. So go ahead and edit this calculation. Oh, parameters, you're so sweet. Parameters knows me so well. I'm the clumsiest typer. And so I have this calculation, the date trunk again, and so I'm passing to the date trunk function, that date part, right? Those values that I created for the parameter, and then the date I want to apply it to. So I'll go ahead and choose OK, and then I'll just need to bring the date drill down, this new calculation, into the view on top of order date. I'm going to do this kind of tricky, so I'll tell you, I'm going to hold down the Alt key because I don't want to just simply replace. I also want to choose to make it continuous because right now it's discrete. So I'll drop it, and I get the drop field menu, and I'm going to choose continuous. And now when I choose OK, well, actually, I saw that the view refreshed, but it didn't look much different. But if I go ahead and change the value of the parameter now to, say, month or quarter, now I can actually change the level of detail of the date in the view. So that's pretty cool. And that's what this scenario is. Another date that parameters and I have been on a few times, quite a few times, is the year-over-year calculations example involving filters. And so what you want to do with the year-over-year calculation, right, is you want to see how am I performing basically this year relative to last. And so what you do is you go and you create a view like this. And it's basically sales broken down by year and month. And then you're like, well, I want it to be year over year, so I can go ahead and use the built-in table calculation that's on sales for year over year growth here. And I do that, and like I said, the view adjusts, and since I don't have any 2013 data, the empty 2014 pane is reassuring. I want to see this year relative to last, so then, I just go ahead and I grab the order date and I drag it onto filters, and I'm just going to filter to this year. Okay, and then this happens. So what happened? So what happened is I filtered out the data that the table calculation needs to perform the year over year calculation. So now I'm like kind of in a pickle, right? So how am I going to do this? You can use me. Use me. Okay, so we'll remove the filter and use a parameter according to our instructions. So I'm back to this view, and I already created the year over year parameter in the lower left, and I'm just going to add it to the view. And we'll look at the values. Okay, so I've got years. That sounds good. They still don't do anything, so of course I need to involve them in a calculation and bring the calculation into the view. And I've already created the calculation to involve them in. It's the year over year. I'll go ahead and edit this calculation. Parameters. I love you more. So helpful. So we'll clean this up and then we'll look at it. Okay, so what is this calculation doing? So what this calculation is doing is it's saying if the year of the parameter, so whatever's in that control, is equal to the year of the record, then return the index, okay? And when that index matches the index, then show that data, or their equivalent. It's true, I should say. So I'll go ahead and accept this calculation, and it brings it down to a measure. And now all I need to do is filter my data using this field. So I drag year over year up to filters, and I want the ones where the years match, not the ones where they don't. So I'll choose true, and okay. And now you can see for 2016, the year over year performance without filtering out the data that I needed in order to do the calculation. And since it's 2017, it looks like I already have sales growth out into the future, so I must be doing really well. So with these parameters, I can create the views that my end users really want without losing the data that I need to create those views. Another way that people use parameters in dates specifically is to control what is the default date in the view. So what you do is you create a dashboard that's meaningful, and it's meaningful today. And you publish it, and you share it with end users, and they go there today, and it's great. I can see my sales today. And then, we go home and we sleep, and we come back tomorrow, and we want to see the sales for today. But the problem is that today is yesterday, because what Tableau does is when you set a filter value, we store it literally in the file format. And so once I set it and saved it, it will always default to that filter value. Well, you can use parameters to give yourself more flexibility here. So let's take a look. So here we're looking at the default filter dates example. It's just sales for Superstore. And if you look in the upper right, I have this default date parameter, and it's currently set to today. But I can change it to give me the summary of sales for yesterday, or give me the summary of sales for last week, for the last week, or the last month. And how this works is that parameter value is used here in the order date filter. I've actually set a filter condition that references that parameter value. Now, this is awesome because it gives you more control over the default experience that people get when they come to your dashboards and your views. And a lot of customers want to take this a step further, and they do. And they do date ranges, right? Well, I want a range of dates. So in this example, in the upper right, I have a date start and a date end, right? A range of dates that I want to see in my view. And you'll notice that I'm actually filtering, right, the view. You can see that in the axis. And this works similarly to the last example. I can show you the condition here. It's just a little bit more. But then what happens is customers or end users do something well, they do something like this. Not like that, sorry, like this, okay? And so what they do is they enter a start date that's after the end date. And so the filter is like, well, that's nothing. They get this blank view and they're confused. So, this is kind of when I started to learn, like, there's a few things about parameters that aren't quite perfect, okay? So, parameters and I, we had to have a talk. Because I want to be able to enforce that the value of one parameter is less than another, right? Or why can't I select multiple parameter values? Why can't I multi-select parameters? Or if you create a parameter from one field in the data source, why don't you update when that field updates, right? So parameters and I had to have a talk. And I listened because I really want to know, who is Tableau parameter? Well, on the surface, parameter has many different faces. The single value list, the compact list slider, Boolean, type in, date. You can see all these examples on the screen. They're all the controls of a parameter. And this is how a parameter communicates. Each of these controls has one thing in common. Parameters in Tableau currently hear only one value at a time. This is part of how parameters in Tableau work. But who is parameter underneath, fundamentally from their upbringing? Well, fundamentally, a parameter is just a variable. A customer asked me once, why did Tableau call them parameters? And I don't know why they're called parameters, but parameter is not a Tableau-specific concept. It's a pretty common concept that's used in a lot of different software and programmatic languages. But from Tableau's perspective on parameters, how we relate to parameters is similar to how X is related to in this calculation. Okay, so by virtue of being in this calculation, we know some things about X. We know that it can be a single value. We also know that it has a specific data type. X is not bananas. 2 bananas plus 14 does not equal 38, right? So the possible values for the variable are defined and constrained by how they're used. So through these conversations that parameters and I shared, we kind of developed this framework for working together, for love. And so parameters in Tableau are singular in value. They have a consistent data type. They're generally static in nature. Skipped one. They're user-defined, which means normally you require user input. You can also do it programmatically. And they're generally static in nature, which means you define the list of values that a parameter can be, and that's the values until you go in and edit that list. So there are, some limitations of parameters in Tableau today. And I want everything in relationship. I want it all. But there's also compromises in relationships, and I wanted to look at the other side too. So, what are some of the advantages of parameters? And really, the main thing that parameters afford is providing control for end users to affect the data and the views that they see based on their analysis and questions. So consider that if we didn't have parameters in Tableau today, we would have to anticipate kind of all the next questions a user would ask. We'd have to create the data structures to support answering those questions, build views on top of those, and publish all that stuff out. And you can see that's not very flexible, and it's kind of a lot of work. So parameters give us controls that allow us to collect end user input to change and manipulate the view. And they're also really pretty flexible. We've already seen some ways you can use a parameter, and we're going to see some more. So parameters, and I took a timeout, right? This is a lot of information I need to digest. And I was thinking, and as time passed, and I started to miss playing with parameters. No one's perfect, and I do want flexibility and control. So I called first. How you doing? I miss you too. We talked it through, and this is really where my relationship parameters got started. So let's take a look at some unique ways to use parameters in analysis. This first scenario, I call it compare to selected. And what I want to be able to do is select a value in the view and see the relative differences to all the other values. Okay, so it'll make sense when we look at it. Let's take a look. Perfect. So here we're looking at sales by subcategory, sorted descending. And in the upper right, you can see I've already created a parameter. It has all the subcategories in it. But let's say I own copiers. And when I come to this view, I care, well, how is copiers doing, how relative to all the other subcategories? So I want to calculate the length of the bars relative to copiers. Okay, well, so we can definitely do that with a parameter. So first thing I'll do is, since I want to have a difference from calculation, I'll go to the measure in the view, and I'll use the built-in calculation, quick table calculation for difference. So that's what I want. And I can see by the way that the view updated actually how it's being calculated, because phone's difference from nothing is 0. So I know it's calculating down. But we want it to be calculated based on this parameter value. So how we do that is we go over to that same pill, and we go to the compute using menu. And I can compute it using the table, which it's doing by default, the cell, but I want to use actually the subcategory. So I choose subcategory here. And nothing changes because I need to tell it which subcategory to use. So I go back to that menu and I say, I want you to compute it using the subcategory, and then I say relative to which subcategory. And there's a bunch of options. I could choose it based on its position in the view, or I could choose a specific one. Maybe I always want copiers. I don't care about anything else. Or I can say, hey, use the parameter. Use whatever is the selection in the parameter as the baseline for this calculation. So that's what we'll do. And notice that the current value is set to appliances. And so when I change the computation, appliances goes to nothing. That's also reassuring. The difference from itself should be 0. So I can use parameters to allow end users to control what kind of comparisons they want to do within a dimension. I call that the compare to selected example. Another comparison that parameters enable that is pretty cool is called compare to date, and it's also known as the index line. So what's an index line? Let's take a look. So in this view, what we're looking at is the housing prices for 20 cities over the last 10 years. And what it's showing is how those prices have changed relative to a specific date. In this case, that date is January 29th, 2013, which it's not a coincidence, matches the parameter value for compare to date. So as I change this parameter value, then the location of the line intersection changes, number one. And number two, all of the relative growth values change because it's using the new date as the baseline. So we can do this with a Tableau parameter today. Let's do this. Here we're starting with basically the same view, except I haven't yet brought the color in. Sorry, I forgot to point out that the current value, the current line that's orange corresponds to this parameter here. So let's just start with that. Seems pretty straightforward. So let's grab the compare to date city from the upper left and drag it onto color. And so I can see where Atlanta is with home prices over time. I can see Chicago. We're in Vegas, so that's interesting. And now, so we have the line color, right? But now what we want to do is we want to add this reference line. So we'll do that. We go over to the analytics pane, and we pick up a reference line and drop it into the view. And I'll set it here to effective date. And when I do that, it brings up the reference line dialog. And what I'm going to do here, which we haven't done yet, is show you that you can create a parameter inside of the reference line dialog. So go ahead and do that. This is called compare to date. And I want it to be date, that's good. And I'll choose all values, so it gives me a calendar picker. I choose OK. I choose OK, it defaults to this date. Okay, so now that I have the line, that's awesome. But I'm not getting that intersection that I want. So how are we going to get the intersection? Well, let me first bring this into the view. There we go. And let's talk this through. So one thing is, the first thing we need to do in order to force all the lines to intersect on the date is we need to get the value of all those cities on that date. So we want to pick out the value for each of the home prices for each city that basically crosses the line. So that's the first thing we need. And then for the growth part of the calculation, we just subtract that value from every other value in the view, right, to get the difference. So let's do that. I already have the compare to date value calculation on the left, so I'll just go ahead and edit that. I want to index your dates on a line. It's not appropriate. All right, so let's go ahead and clean this up, and then we'll talk about it. Okay, perfect. So what's going on here is we're saying if the month of the date is equal to the month of the parameter, then return the home price. So that's how we grab that home price on that date, okay? And it's a window table calculation, so we say start from the beginning of the window and go to the end. So wherever that line is, grab that number. So we can apply that. And then we need the difference, so I'll go ahead and open the compare to difference date calculation. And that's just simply a difference from our baseline, which we just talked about. And then if I want it to be a percentage, then I can take it the step further and turn it into a 1 plus x minus y over y growth calculation, which hopefully looks familiar. Okay, so now if I bring this into the view and replace the sales, the home price with it, then I expect all of the lines to redraw and intersect on the reference line. And it works. And as I change the value of this line, then it's recalculated. So I think this is really hot. I don't know if you do, but I think it's hot. So I call that the compare to date. It's really how do I make a reference line in Tableau, but the mechanism we're using is a comparison to a date with a parameter. I'd love to point out the second resource on this slide. One of our Zen masters took an index chart that was published by the New York Times, recreated it in Tableau, and then did a few more, like took it a little bit further than I did here. So I wanted to provide that reference for you if you're interested. So after our big fight and then a makeup, Parameters and I have been getting along great, so we are getting ready to travel together. And it's serious business when you travel with someone. So I'm going to show you all the places you can go with Parameters. Oops. So the first scenario here I call the landing page pattern. And basically how customers use this is, you don't have 1 or 2 parameters, but you might have like 5 or 10 input values that you want the users to first select. And then you want to take them to the resulting view that comes from accommodating or including all of those values. So you land them on an input page, and then you navigate them to the result. So we'll take a look. So in this example, I have an input page for landing page input, and I have a landing page dashboard. So there are 2 different views. And on the input page, I collect some values from my end users, like maybe I don't want the region to be east, I want it to be central. Furniture, let's go ahead and change it to this year. And then the threshold value, let's make it 25. And then I provide this button-like thing for the users, and I say, click here to go. And they go, and they get this view, which reflects their selections. It reflects central, furniture, the start date. And these are also affecting the views as well, right? You can see region is filtered accordingly. The category here is filtered accordingly, and that threshold value, we're way under it. That's included in the category view in the middle right. And then the axis below is also accommodating the start date parameter. Now, there's a little gotcha with this. First of all, this is a pretty commonly used pattern, which is why it's included. But there is a gotcha, so I want to make sure that you know that sometimes when you create these navigation buttons, they're like worksheets that you turn into buttons with actions, with filter actions. Tableau sometimes will eat your first click, okay? So you create this button and you click it and it doesn't do anything. You're like, what? And then you click it again and then it goes. This is actually an artifact of how selection works today in Tableau. Once you select something, it is selected, so the next click will unselect it. But there is also a workaround for this that's documented in the resource, and it involves slightly manipulating that action to make it into a special type of filter action, which means it never thinks it's selected. So look into the resources for that yeah, it's right there, Viz Painter. So that's the landing page scenario. The next place you can go with parameters is in URL actions. So you want users to select some stuff, and then you want to pass values to a target sheet, and it could be within your dashboard in like a web object or an external sheet, and you want the values that they select for the parameters, which that's what they're interested in, to be consumed and reflected in your next view. So we'll look at this, the URL action parameter. And here I just have a simple dashboard, sales by state on the top, but then I want to provide some contextual information that's relevant to what they're looking at. So I've chosen a Wikipedia view, and I've put that in the parameter value in the upper right. You could have lots of different views. So how does this work when I select, well, it defaulted to California. So when I select Texas, I get this URL action parameter in my tooltip. And when I click the URL action parameter, then the contextually relevant information is loaded. So I get the Wikipedia page for Texas. So how that works is in the dashboard actions, I have created this action with parameter. And basically it says on menu, so that's how I get that blue link, but I could choose select or hover instead. Navigate to here. So that URL is the parameter value itself plus whatever the user selected for the state. So I can use parameters in actions in Tableau to load relevant information or control like one view from another. And then in a similar example, but really more kind of online focused, if you have Tableau Online or Tableau Public or Tableau Server, you can pass user specified values into the URL parameters, okay? So let me back up. Remember, parameters is not a Tableau concept, so obviously URLs have parameters too. Hopefully that makes sense. So what I want to do is I want a user to select something from one view, and I'm going to put it in the URL, and then the target view is going to interpret that URL and apply that value to the next view. So I can pass filter values, and I can pass parameter values through the URL. Okay. So first of all, let's just deconstruct it really quick. And I'm going to focus on this middle one here. So basically, I just have a view that's published to a Tableau Online site. And then with a question mark, I pass the state is equal to Nevada. So in this case, there is a filter called state, and I'm passing the value Nevada. And if I copy and paste that into a browser, then it will open this view with Nevada in play. And so it looks like it's an order details table. That's great. And I can see for that filter, specifically the one called state, that the value Nevada is set. So I have another example of this where I've actually, instead of copying and pasting the URL into the browser, what I've done is I've updated this dashboard so that in this overview chart, when I come here and I see these cities and these profit ratios and this performance and I want more detail, when I pick a specific state or mark, then it will navigate me to a detail view that's filtered specifically for that mark. And in this case, it's state. So we'll choose Nevada here. And when I click it, it opens a page. And again, you can see Nevada is again reflected in my view. So customers you can kind of stitch together, drill across or drill down, right? Examples where you have some data, and then when users specify what they're interested in, you take them to more and more data that's tailored to what they want to know about. Okay, and then another place that people can go with parameters is in the JavaScript API. So if you are building web applications and embedding Tableau views, then this is definitely something you might want to do. So basically, I have a view here, parameters with the JavaScript API, and all I've done is created an HTML page. You can see it here, JavaScript space API.html in the URL. And oh shoot, I just gave away my demo. and I'm pointing out to a view that's published on public, and I'm embedded it into my HTML page. Now notice this churn rate here, it's 12.3. Well, how did that happen? So this is my HTML code for the page, including the JavaScript. And what I do is, near the bottom in line 40, when I load the page, I'm going to initialize the view. And so that calls this function here. And then I go ahead and define a container, and I tell it which URL to go to. That's line 14. And then if you scan down, notice on line 18, I set the literal churn rate. That's a parameter, okay? So I'm actually programmatically setting this value. And so let's change it to something else. Let's change it to 0.09, and we'll go ahead and hit save. So when I go back to the view and I refresh it, On load, I expect that churn rate to reflect what I set programmatically. And it does. It says, can you see it? It says 9%. So that worked. So I can set the values of parameters with the JavaScript API. That's a very simple example. You can do a lot more complex stuff. I can also update it. So when I change this value for the parameter, I click the churn rate. I went ahead and I put in an alert that let me know you changed it. Oh, and I got hugs and kisses too. Parameters, so sweet. So you can use parameters with the JavaScript API. And I have to tell you, actually the documentation on this is really pretty good. I'm not super programmatic, so if I can do it, anyone can, for sure. Finally, one more place that people go with parameters is they use them in custom SQL queries. So what does this involve? Well, this is when you write your own SQL in your data connection, and you pass your SQL back to the database and kind of specify exactly what you want. Before we show the example, I want to caution you that when you use this custom or ad hoc SQL in Tableau, you kind of forfeit some of the performance advantages or optimizations that we do when we write your SQL. You know, when you're dragging and dropping pills, we're writing SQL on the back end, and then there's a bunch of optimizations that happen to try to make that fast. With the custom or the ad hoc SQL, you bypass that whole goodness, okay? So just keep that in mind. But basically, we're looking at a view. It's from a date dimension table that I loaded onto a database back in Seattle. And I'm looking at, if you look in the upper right, November 1 to 12/31. So 2 months. Maybe I only want 1 month. So I'll go ahead and change this to 12/1. And after a second, the view will update to only show December. How that's working is in the data connection window. Sorry about that. Instead of dragging my table, my whole table over, right, and then picking the fields and stuff, I've added a custom SQL query instead. And if we take a look at that query, we can see that it's just selecting 4 fields from this table. And it's using the parameters as the condition in the where clause, so that I'm only selecting the rows where the date is greater than the from date and greater than or equal to the from date and less than or equal to the to date. So again, there may be some performance implications of doing that, but there's also real value in just sometimes being able to just grab a few rows and let's get this working, and then we'll open it up or something. So you can use parameters with custom SQL queries as well. I guess I forgot to show that slide. And I put in a screenshot in case the network was down. So we've talked about, can you believe it? We've gone through 10 use cases for parameters in an hour. We're amazing. So you can do all these things with parameters. And then there's also the ones we didn't talk about, and the basic ones and the Jedi ones. And so there's many, many ways to use parameters. These lists are not exhaustive. And I definitely invite you to play with parameters. We're not exclusive, and I won't be offended if you want to do that. And if you find a really cool way you think this would be a great example, I'd love to hear about it. Because I've looked at a lot, but it's interesting to know what you think is really cool too. Now, I know we have 2 minutes, so I think the summary, though, is you can use parameters directly in forms, you can use them through calculations, but ultimately what you're able to do is provide more flexibility to your end users. Flexibility and control to your end users so they can ask and answer their questions that they have. I did put together a list of examples in the wild. Out of respect for your time, I'll leave the list in here. And we won't review them together, but you will have them when you get the presentation content. And you can go here, and these are just to show you, hey, this is how people are using these for real. This is it. This thing doesn't repeat anymore unless we go back in time and we do it again. And there were some related sessions. There is one that's kind of going on right now, so I guess you chose this over that. But then next up, this last one, this and action dashboard appeal. One of my colleagues is giving an overview of how interactivity in dashboards works, and part of that involves parameters, so you can understand parameters better related to all the other stuff in dashboards. Thank you very much. Here's my contact information. Feel free to reach out anytime, and definitely, please complete the session survey. I read every one. I really value your feedback, so please do that. And just thank you for being here in this session, and thank you for coming to TC.